First of all, I would like to thank Andre for inviting me to Berlin, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight to hear us speak. Let me tell you first why I think the West is responsible for the crisis, and then let me say a few words about why I think the evidence shows that Putin, and more generally, the Russians, are not responsible for the crisis. My view is that what precipitated the crisis was the West's attempt to make Ukraine part of the West, to peel it away from Russia's orbit and to integrate Ukraine into the West. This strategy that the West was pursuing had three elements. The first element was NATO expansion. And you want to remember that in April 2008, NATO announced at the end of the Bucharest summit that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. Putin and numerous other Russians made it perfectly clear that this was unacceptable and they were not going to allow it to happen. The second strand in the strategy is EU expansion. In other words, the West was determined to make Ukraine, and Georgia for that matter, a part of NATO and a part of the EU. The third part of the strategy was democracy promotion. Now, it's very hard to be opposed to democracy promotion because in principle we all like democracy. But you have to understand that when the Americans engage in democracy promotion, what they're really interested in doing is toppling governments that are not friendly to the United States, even if they're democratic, and putting in place governments that are friendly. And Andre just talked about the February 22nd coup, and it was a coup. The Americans supported that coup, and the Americans were interested in getting rid of Yanukovych, who was basically pro-Russian, and putting in his place a government that was pro-American. And of course, that's exactly what happened, and as Andre made clear, that was the spark that lit the fire. But what I'm saying to you is that you have to understand that there were three strands to the strategy: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and democracy promotion. And all of this was an attempt by the West to make Ukraine part of the West. No great power, and this includes the Russians, and this includes the United States, and this includes China in the future, is going to allow another great power to march its military alliance up to its border. As many of you know, we in the United States have what's called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine says that no European great power, no Asian great power, no distant great power can move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. All of you have heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some of us are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happened there was the Soviet Union had the audacity to put missiles in Cuba. They had the audacity to put military forces in our neighborhood. The United States said that was unacceptable, and the Kennedy administration was willing to risk nuclear war to force Khrushchev to take those missiles out of Cuba. The United States does not tolerate military powers from afar coming into the Western Hemisphere. Well, the same basic logic applies to the Russians. The Russians will not tolerate a situation where Ukraine becomes part of the West. And Putin told us that on numerous occasions. And indeed, the August 2008 war between Russia and Georgia was over that very issue. It was in April 2008 at Bucharest that NATO said Georgia and Ukraine would become part of the West. It's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that a few months later, in August 2008, you had a war over Georgia because the president of Georgia thought that he could become part of the West and the Russians would just stand idly by. He was wrong. So what is driving this crisis, and nothing's changed because the West is still pursuing this policy and Ukraine is foolishly going along with the West, what's driving this crisis is the West's efforts to peel Ukraine away from Russia's orbit. Now, let me say a few words about Putin because this is very important. Putin is now portrayed in the West, here in Germany, and much more so in the United States, as a highly aggressive individual who is determined to conquer neighboring countries and create a greater Russia that looks something like the former Soviet Union. Some people even argue that he is, in effect, the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and that this is the 1930s. This argument is wrong. And the key point that you want to keep in mind is that before the coup that Andre talked about, the coup on February 22nd, 2014, nobody in the West was saying that Putin was aggressive. Nobody was saying that we need NATO expansion to prevent Putin from going on the offensive and conquering territory. It was only after February 22nd when the West's policy blew up in its face that the West then blamed Putin, and he all of a sudden became another Adolf Hitler. Nobody was arguing that before February 22nd, 2014. I will close by saying that George Kennan, the famous American strategic expert and the father of containment policy during the Cold War, said in 1999 when NATO expansion started. You all remember that the first NATO expansion after the Cold War was in 1999. The second was in 2004. In 1999, George Kennan said, "This is a ridiculously foolish policy. There is no reason to expand NATO eastward." And Kennan then said, what's going to happen here is that this is going to lead to a major crisis with the Russians, and then we're going to blame the Russians. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what happened. I think what the West is doing is what we call in the United States doubling down. In other words, they're just ramping up the existing policy. This is, in my opinion, strategically foolish. It's only going to make the war in Ukraine more intense, more Ukrainians are going to die, and it's going to further poison relations between Russia and the West, and especially between Russia and the United States. So it makes no sense, in my opinion, to do that. Let me say a few more words about why I think that. First of all, if the West arms the Ukrainians and trains the Ukrainians, does the things that Claudia was talking about, the Russians are not going to sit still and allow the West to do that. The Russians are going to counter-escalate. They will send troops of their own, weapons of their own into eastern Ukraine, and they will make sure that the Ukrainians do not defeat the separatists. It's very important to understand that the West is not going to fight in Ukraine, because Ukraine is not of vital strategic interest for the United States or for the West more generally. You are not hearing any of the war hawks in America, and there are many of them. They are not saying we should fight in Ukraine. The Russians, on the other hand, will fight in Ukraine because, again, Ukraine is of vital strategic interest to Russia. So the Russians have a profound interest in making sure Ukraine does not win. Second point, the Ukrainian army is a terrible army. The Russian army is much bigger and much better. The idea that the West can turn the Ukrainian army into a formidable fighting force that can defeat the Russian army and the separatists is a dream. It's not going to happen, okay? So, the end result is the crisis will escalate and more Ukrainians will die, and again, relations between East and West will get worse, not better. But let's assume that I'm wrong, okay? Let's assume that I'm wrong and that the West is successful at driving the costs up for the Russians. And let's assume that Putin is desperate. What do you think is going to happen then? All I will say is that you want to remember that Russia has thousands of nuclear warheads, and Russia views what the West is doing as a threat to its vital interests. I believe that backing someone like Putin into a corner and putting him in a situation where he's desperate and where he has nuclear weapons is playing with fire. It is a remarkably foolish policy, especially when you realize that Ukraine is not of vital strategic interest for the United States, for Germany, for France, or for Britain.
Yeah, I have two more questions which are actually linked, at least in the discussion here in Germany and I think also in other NATO countries. The first part of the question is, did the US actually anticipate what would happen around Crimea, that it would become part of Russia as a result of the escalation? And the second part is that the narrative here is that if we as the West are not showing strength towards Russia, they will continue also to incorporate the east of Ukraine or maybe all of Ukraine or also part of Moldova into Russia. Do you think this narrative has any value or not?
With regard to the first question as to whether the West anticipated what the Russians did after February 22, 2014, the answer is simply no. Again, we did not believe before February 22nd that Putin was aggressive in any way. We thought that we could expand NATO, we could expand the EU, and we could promote democracy in Kiev, which again means putting a pro-American leader in place, and Putin would stand idly by and do nothing. That was our view.